Nausea was a deeply unromantic feeling. Ilara Vance decided this with the grim finality of a judge passing sentence. It coiled in her stomach, a bitter, unwelcome guest at the Duke of Rutland's ridiculously opulent ball. It had nothing to do with the champagne, which she had not touched, nor the canapés, which she had politely refused. It was the air itself, thick with the scent of wilting roses, beeswax, and a suffocating perfume of self-congratulation. She stood near a pillar of mock Corinthian marble, the heavy silk of her gown a cage of her own making. It was a beautiful gown, the color of clotted cream, and had cost a fortune her father could easily afford. That was the problem, of course. Her father's fortune. It hung about her like a gaudy, ill-fitting shawl, marking her as other. Ilara Vance, daughter of a shipping magnate whose name was whispered with a mixture of awe and contempt. New money. So very new it still smelled of the sea and coal dust. Her gaze drifted across the ballroom, a churning sea of silks, jewels, and powdered hair. She catalogued them with the dispassionate eye of an accountant reviewing a ledger. The Dowager Countess of Abernathy, whose debts were a thing of legend. Lord Ashworth, who had gambled away 2 properties in a single night. And there, laughing with a vapid blonde whose title was centuries older than her intellect, was Julian Croft. A familiar, cold stone settled in the place where her heart was supposed to be. Julian. Her former fiancé. He had courted her with pretty words and melting glances for 6 months, speaking of a union of his heritage and her father's dynamism. A partnership. Then, a more advantageous match had presented itself, the vapid blonde with the ancient title, and Julian had discarded her with a letter so full of polite regret it was a masterpiece of cowardly cruelty. The wound was no longer raw, but it had left a scar, a tight, puckered reminder to never again mistake charm for character. She had come tonight to prove she was unbothered. A foolish, girlish impulse she now regretted. All she had proven was that she was an outsider, a solitary ship in a hostile harbor. Her posture was a fortress, her expression a carefully neutral mask. She was observing, always observing, the intricate dance of power and obligation, the subtle trades of influence for status. It was a different kind of commerce, but commerce all the same. A sudden jostle from a passing guest sent a wave of claret from a nearby gentleman's glass arcing through the air. Ilara stepped back instinctively, but it was too late. A dark, crimson stain bloomed across the polished toe of a nearby boot. A boot of exquisite, unforgivingly black leather. Her eyes traveled up from the boot, past a leg encased in impeccably tailored black trousers, over a waistcoat of severe, unadorned silk, to a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite and left out in a winter storm. High cheekbones, a straight, aristocratic nose, and a mouth set in a line of permanent displeasure. His eyes, the color of slate, were fixed on the splash of wine with an expression of profound irritation. It was the Duke of Beaumont. Alastair. A man whose title was so old it was said his ancestors had argued with the architects of Stonehenge. He was a pillar of the aristocracy, a man who represented everything she was not. Heritage. Legacy. An unshakable, inborn sense of his own superiority. He was also, her father had mentioned in passing, a man teetering on the precipice of financial ruin. A fact clearly not advertised by the severe perfection of his attire. "My apologies, Your Grace," the clumsy gentleman stammered, his face paling. The Duke did not even grant the man a glance. His cold gaze lifted, sweeping past the offender and landing, with damning precision, on Ilara. It was as if she, by her mere proximity, was responsible for the chaos. His eyes raked over her, taking in the expensive gown, the slightly too modern style of her hair, the very air of commerce that clung to her. His lip curled, a minute, dismissive movement. "One expects a certain lack of grace from the merchant class," he said, his voice low and carrying, a whip crack in the general din, "but one would hope they would not spill their wares all over the floor." The words landed like stones. The clumsy gentleman scurried away, relieved to be forgotten. A few people nearby, including Julian's new fiancée, tittered. The sound was like grinding glass. Heat flooded Ilara's cheeks, a hot, shameful tide. He had not just insulted her. He had dismissed her entire existence, her family, her world, as something cheap and clumsy, something to be wiped off his shoe. For a heartbeat, the old, wounded part of her wanted to shrink, to stammer an apology and flee. But the last 6 months since Julian's betrayal had forged something new in her. Something harder. The nausea in her stomach vanished, replaced by a spike of pure, cold fury. It was a clarifying, empowering rage. She did not speak. Words were his weapon, honed over centuries of casual cruelty. Her weapons were different. They were numbers, contracts, and an absolute refusal to be broken. Instead, she met his slate-gray eyes directly. She held his gaze, letting him see the ice in her own. Then, with deliberate, theatrical slowness, she sank into a curtsy. It was not a timid dip, it was a profound, sweeping obeisance, a masterpiece of form she had practiced for hours with a stern dancing master. It was a curtsy of mocking perfection, so deep her silk gown pooled around her on the floor. She rose just as slowly, her spine ramrod straight. She kept his gaze locked the entire time. Her face was a mask of polite indifference, but her eyes conveyed the message. You think this is my place? On the floor before you. Very well. I will own it. A flicker of something, surprise. Annoyance, crossed his granite features. He had expected tears or a flustered retreat. He had not expected this silent, insolent compliance. Without another word, Ilara turned her back on him. The movement was precise, controlled. She did not flee. She made a strategic exit. She walked calmly, head high, through the chattering sea of aristocrats, past a suddenly less amused Julian, and out of the ballroom. The oppressive scent of roses and wax followed her, but it could not touch the cold, clean purpose that was now crystallizing in her soul. He had told her to know her place. Clear's throat. A challenge. And Ilara Vance never, ever backed down from a challenge. The Duke's insult was not a wound, it was a whetstone. It sharpened her resolve to a razor's edge. For the next 6 hours, Ilara did not sleep. She did not weep. She sat in the study of her father's London townhouse, the scent of lemon wax and old paper a comforting balm. The gas lamps hissed softly, casting a golden glow on the ledgers and correspondence spread across the vast mahogany desk. This was her world, her comfort, her arsenal. Her father, a man who understood the tides of commerce better than any sailor understood the sea, had taught her to read the world through its balance sheets. He believed sentiment was a liability and information was the most valuable currency. Find the debt, he'd always said. Everyone, from a fishmonger to a king, has a debt. Find it, and you find their leash. The Duke of Beaumont. Alistair. His face, cold and contemptuous, was etched in her mind. Know your place. Very well. She would. She would find her place, and it would be at the very center of his world, holding his leash. She began to pull on the threads her father's agents and informants had been gathering for months. They were interested in the aristocracy not for their titles, but for their fragility. They were overleveraged, asset-rich but cash-poor, a fleet of magnificent, rotting ships. The Beaumont Duchy was one of the most magnificent, and one of the most rotten. The ledgers told a story of generations of mismanagement. Of foolish investments in failed ventures, of agricultural lands bleeding revenue, of a lifestyle maintained on credit and pride. The final, fatal blow had been Alistair's grandfather's obsession with collecting rare manuscripts, paid for with a series of mortgages against the ducal seat itself, Blackwood Manor. The name struck a chord. Blackwood. A sprawling, Gothic monstrosity in the heart of the country, famed for its 1,000 acres of ancient oaks and its cripplingly expensive roof. It was the very soul of the Beaumont legacy. And it was hemorrhaging money. By 4 a.m, fueled by black tea and a cold, burning sense of purpose, she found the linchpin. The collection of mortgages had been consolidated and sold to a consortium of London bankers. And that consortium, facing its own liquidity crisis, was quietly, almost secretly, auctioning off the debt itself. Not the property, that would be too public, too scandalous. They were selling the power to foreclose. The auction was not in a grand hall, but in a dusty solicitor's office in the city. It was scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning. In less than 6 hours. A slow smile touched Ilara's lips. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a predator that had just caught the scent of its prey. The bankers wanted cash, quickly and discreetly. They would not care where it came from. She did not wake her father. This was her own war, to be fought with her own capital. Her inheritance from her mother, combined with her own shrewd investments in her father's shipping ventures, had grown into a formidable sum. It was her independence, her security. And now, it would be her weapon. By 9:30, she was seated in a worn velvet chair in the solicitor's cramped, musty office. The air smelled of stale tobacco and decaying paper. She was the only woman there, a fact that drew more than a few curious, dismissive glances from the handful of gray-faced men in attendance. They saw a young woman in a modest but well-made traveling suit and assumed she was a clerk or a secretary. They did not see the architect of their downfall. The auction was a quiet, tense affair. The bidding started low. The men around her were cautious, bottom feeders looking for a quick profit by reselling the debt. They made their bids in small, timid increments. Ilara remained silent, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She let them nibble, feeling out the limits of their courage. Finally, when the bidding began to stall, she spoke. Her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the murmuring. She named a figure that was 50% higher than the current bid. A collective intake of breath hissed through the room. The men turned to stare at her, their expressions shifting from dismissal to shock. Who was this girl? She met their gazes without flinching, her expression unreadable. One of the bolder men, a fleshy specimen with a sweat-sheened brow, countered her bid. Before the auctioneer could even acknowledge it, Ilara spoke again, her voice even colder this time. She doubled her previous increment. It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration of overwhelming force. She was not there to haggle. She was there to win. The fleshy man paled, shaking his head slightly. The others fell silent. They were playing with pennies, she had just rolled a cannon onto the table. Sold, the auctioneer finally said, his gavel cracking down with a sound of utter finality. To Miss Vance. She signed the papers with a steady hand, the ink flowing smoothly from the nib of the pen. She was now the legal holder of the debt secured against Blackwood Manor. She owned the Duke of Beaumont's past, his present, and, most importantly, his future. An hour later, her carriage rolled through the gates of Beaumont House in London. It was a fortress of a building, grey and imposing, designed to project an image of unassailable power. An image that was now a lie. The butler, a man who looked as ancient and stony as the house itself, tried to refuse her entry. The Duke is not receiving visitors. I am not a visitor, Ilara said, her voice cool. I am a creditor. Inform His Grace that Miss Vance is here to discuss the mortgage on Blackwood Manor. I believe he will find the time. She held up the portfolio of legal documents. The butler's professional mask faltered. He recognized the look of a solicitor's portfolio. He bowed stiffly and showed her into a small, cold receiving room. The furniture was priceless but worn, the heavy velvet curtains admitting only grudging slivers of daylight. The air was thick with the chill of unspoken panic. She did not have to wait long. Alastair, the Duke of Beaumont, stormed into the room. He was not wearing the severe evening attire of the night before, but a dressing gown of dark, worn wool. His hair was uncombed, and his face was pale with a mixture of exhaustion and fury. He had clearly just been woken. What is the meaning of this? He snapped, his voice a low growl. What is this farce about Blackwood? Ilara remained seated. She let him stand and loom, a tactic designed to intimidate. It did not work. She was no longer the girl by the pillar. She was the woman who held the deed to his ancestral soul. Good morning, Your Grace, she said, her tone level and businesslike. I trust you slept well. I did not. I was rather busy. She gestured to the chair opposite her. Please, sit. This is a business matter. He stared at her, his jaw tight. For a moment, she thought he would refuse, that his pride would not allow him to take a seat at her invitation in his own house. But then, a flicker of something that looked like dread crossed his face. He sat, perching on the edge of the chair like a bird of prey ready to strike. This morning, Ilara began, opening the portfolio, the consolidated debt secured against your property at Blackwood was sold at auction. I purchased it. She slid the top document across the small table between them. His signature was on the original loan agreement, bold and arrogant. He stared at the paper, then at her. The fury in his eyes was slowly being eclipsed by a dawning, horrified understanding. He looked utterly poleaxed. You, he breathed, the word a mixture of disbelief and disgust. Me, she confirmed. The terms of the loan, as you know, are quite clear. The principal is now due in full. I believe the sum is, she consulted a paper, though she knew the number by heart, rather significant. I am, of course, within my rights to begin foreclosure proceedings immediately. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the frantic ticking of a mantel clock. The sound seemed to be counting down the seconds of his ruin. The color had drained completely from his face. He looked not like a duke, but like a man facing a firing squad. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice rough. "Money." "Is this blackmail?" "Blackmail is such an ugly word, Your Grace," Ilara said smoothly. "I prefer to think of it as a strategic investment. My father taught me that every sound investment must have a clear objective. Money is not my objective here." "Then what is?" he demanded. Ilara leaned forward slightly. She looked him directly in the eye, the same way she had on the ballroom floor. "Last night, you advised me to know my place. I have taken your advice to heart. My place, I have decided, is as the Duchess of Beaumont." He recoiled as if she had struck him. A harsh, incredulous laugh escaped his lips. "You are insane." "I am a pragmatist," she corrected him. "Let me present you with the terms of our bargain. You will marry me. In exchange, on our wedding day, I will sign over the deed to the debt, marking it paid in full. I will also transfer a significant sum of my own capital into an account under your control, sufficient to clear your other debts and begin the necessary repairs and investments to make your estates profitable again." She let the terms hang in the air. It was a lifeline. A golden, glorious lifeline, offered by the very woman he had scorned. "I am offering you a choice," she continued, her voice soft but relentless. "On the one hand, you have ruin. The loss of Blackwood, the disgrace of your name, the end of your family's legacy. On the other hand, you have me. A wife of the merchant class, to be sure. But a wife who comes with solvency. A business arrangement, nothing more. No pretense of affection will be required. You will have your title, your home, and your financial security. I will have the protection of your name and a permanent, unassailable place in a society that would otherwise be happy to spit on me." His hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists on his knees. He was staring at her, his face a mask of warring emotions, fury, humiliation, and the cold, dawning horror of a trapped animal. He was a duke. He was Beaumont. Men like him did not get cornered. And yet, here he was, caged by a slip of a girl and a stack of papers. "This is monstrous," he whispered. "No, Your Grace," Ilara said, rising to her feet. "This is business. You have until noon tomorrow to give me your answer. Though, I think we both know what it will be." She left the documents on the table, a testament to her victory. She walked out of the room, leaving him alone in the cold, silent house with the ticking clock and the ruins of his pride. The marriage ceremony was a study in frigid formality. It took place not in a grand cathedral, but in the same dusty solicitor's office where she had sealed his fate. The only witnesses were her father, whose expression was an unreadable mix of pride and concern, and the Duke's solicitor, a man who looked profoundly miserable. Ilara wore a simple gown of dove grey. Alastair wore a suit of black so severe it was practically mourning attire. They spoke their vows in clipped, toneless voices, refusing to look at each other. The air crackled with a tension so thick it felt like another presence in the room. When the solicitor prompted him to place the ring on her finger, his hand was cold, his touch impersonal and brief. The thin gold band felt less like a symbol of union and more like the shackle on a prisoner. True to her word, the moment the register was signed, Ilara produced the deed to the debt. With a flourish, she signed it over to him and pushed the document declaring the mortgage null and void across the table. His eyes followed the paper, a flicker of something, relief, resentment, in their depths. Then, she handed his solicitor the bank draft for the promised capital. The man's eyes widened almost comically at the number of zeros. The bargain was sealed. She was the Duchess of Beaumont. He was solvent. And they were, in all likelihood, the two most miserable newlyweds in all of England. The journey to Blackwood Manor was undertaken in a suffocating silence. They sat on opposite sides of the ducal carriage, the new crest on the door a mockery of the division within. Ilara stared out the window, watching the neat fields of the home counties give way to the wilder, more rugged landscape of the north. Alastair stared at the floor, his jaw set like a trap. Blackwood, when it finally appeared, was both more magnificent and more dilapidated than she had imagined. It rose from the landscape like a great, grey beast, a jumble of Gothic towers, Tudor gables, and Elizabethan chimneys. It was a testament to centuries of Beaumont pride and ambition. But as they drew closer, the decay became apparent. Patches of moss grew on the slate roof, a few windows were boarded over, and the stone of the grand entryway was stained with damp. It was a house on sand, a fortress with a crumbling foundation. Her house, now. The staff was assembled in the cavernous main hall to greet them. An elderly, stooped butler, a housekeeper with a face like a clenched fist, and a handful of maids and footmen. They looked at her with expressions ranging from thinly veiled curiosity to outright hostility. She was the interloper, the foreign body invading their world. Alastair addressed them in a clipped, formal tone. "This is the Duchess. You will afford her every courtesy." He did not say, "Your Duchess." He did not say, "My wife." He said, "The Duchess," as if she were a piece of furniture that had been delivered. Then he turned to her. "The housekeeper, Mrs. Croft, will show you to your rooms. They are in the east wing. My own are in the west." The message was clear. A house divided. A marriage in name only. Without another word, he strode away, his boots echoing on the flagstones, leaving her alone with his hostile staff in the cold, echoing hall of his ancestral home. The air smelled of damp wool, wet earth, and something else, the faint, cloying scent of decay. Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper, stepped forward. Her eyes were small and sharp. "This way, Your Grace," she said, the title sounding like an accusation. Ilara followed her up the grand staircase, her hand trailing on the carved oak banister. The wood was cold and slightly sticky with neglect. She felt a splinter, sharp and needle-like, pierce the skin of her palm. She pulled her hand back, looking at the tiny bead of blood that welled up. A fitting welcome. Even the house itself was hostile. Her rooms were vast and cold. A fire had been lit in the hearth, but it seemed to do little more than beat back the oppressive chill. The furniture was heavy and dark, shrouded in dust covers as if awaiting a funeral. It was clear these rooms had not been used in years. "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" Mrs. Croft asked, her arms crossed. "Yes," Ilara said, pulling off her gloves and turning to face the woman. "I will require the estate account books. All of them. For the last 20 years. Have them brought to the library within the hour." The housekeeper's jaw dropped. She had clearly expected a request for tea, or a hot bath, or for her trunks to be unpacked. She had not expected this. The account books, Your Grace." "You heard me correctly," Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. "And please have a proper fire laid in the library. And tea. A great deal of tea." Mrs. Croft stared at her for a moment longer, then gave a stiff, resentful curtsy and departed. Ilara walked to the tall, mullioned window and looked out. The view was of a formal garden, now choked with weeds, and beyond it, the dark, brooding expanse of the ancient woods that gave the manor its name. It was a landscape of shadows and secrets. Her husband despised her. His staff resented her. His house was actively trying to crumble around her. She was utterly alone, a stranger in a strange land. She should have been terrified. She should have been miserable. Instead, as she looked at the heavy, leather-bound ledgers that a footman was now struggling to carry into the library, she felt a flicker of something she had not felt in a long time. Anticipation. The battle was over. The war was just beginning. The first week at Blackwood was a campaign fought in silence and ink. Ilara established the library as her command post. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories high with towering shelves of books, but like everything else, it suffered from neglect. A film of dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. She ordered the windows thrown open and fires lit day and night, battling the damp chill with heat and fresh air. The account books were a disaster. They were a sprawling, chaotic narrative of denial. Entries were vague, figures were fudged, and entire seasons of income and expenditure seemed to be missing. It was not just mismanagement, it was a deliberate, generational refusal to face reality. The Beaumonts had been treating their estate not as a business, but as a divine right that should fund itself through sheer force of its own blue blood. She worked relentlessly, often late into the night, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scratching of her pen. She created new ledgers, cross-referencing old invoices with tenant records, building a true picture of the financial rot from the ground up. The work was methodical and deeply satisfying. It was a puzzle, and she was good at puzzles. Her husband, the Duke, was a ghost. She saw him only at dinner, a tense, silent affair held in a dining room so vast their 2 seats at opposite ends of the long table felt like separate continents. They exchanged the barest of civilities. "Please pass the salt, is the beef to your liking?" Their conversation was a barren landscape of politeness, each word carefully chosen to betray nothing. He would eat quickly, drink a single glass of claret, and then retreat to his wing of the house, to his own solitude. She could feel his eyes on her sometimes, a heavy, resentful gaze. He was watching her, waiting for her to fail, to give up and retreat to the frivolous pursuits he surely expected of her. She gave him nothing. She simply worked. The staff, led by the formidable Mrs. Croft, treated her with a cold, correct obedience. They did what she asked, but no more. They were his people, their loyalty forged over generations. She was the usurper, the woman who had bought her title. But they were also practical people. When her orders began to make sense, when she arranged for a bulk purchase of coal that lowered the heating costs, or renegotiated with a local merchant for better prices on household supplies, a subtle shift began. They still did not like her, but the hostility in their eyes began to be replaced by a grudging curiosity. The first real crack in the fortress of their mutual animosity came at the end of her second week. She had summoned the estate manager, a man named Henderson whose family had served the Beaumonts for a century. He was loyal to the Duke, but he was also a farmer at heart, and he was pained by the state of the land. They were in the library. Ilara had spread maps of the estate across the massive table. "Mr. Henderson," she began, her tone crisp and businesslike, "I have been reviewing the yields from the tenant farms. They have fallen by 30% in the last decade. Why?" Henderson shifted his weight, twisting his cap in his hands. "The soil is tired, Your Grace. Needs lime. And the drainage in the south fields is poor. We've been telling the old Duke, and this one, 4 years. But there was never the money." "There is money now," Ilara said simply. "Draw up a comprehensive plan. What you need, who you need to hire, what it will cost. I want the fields drained before the winter rains and limed before the spring planting. I also see here we are selling all our wool, unmilled, for a pittance at the local market. Why do we not have our own mill?" "We did, Your Grace," Henderson said, a note of old sadness in his voice. "On the river. But it fell into disrepair 30 years ago. Cheaper to sell the raw wool, his lordship's grandfather decided." "A foolish decision," a new voice said from the doorway. Both Ilara and Henderson turned. Alastair stood there, leaning against the doorframe. He was dressed for riding, but had clearly stopped on his way out. He must have been listening. "It was a foolish decision," he repeated, walking into the room. He stopped at the table, his gaze falling on the maps and Ilara's neat columns of figures. "My great-grandfather sold the milling rights to the Cotter family for the price of a mediocre racehorse. That horse, incidentally, broke its leg in its first race." He said it without emotion, a simple statement of historical fact. Ilara was taken aback. It was the most he had said to her in 2 weeks. And it was not an attack. It was an observation. A shared one. "Then we will buy the rights back," she said, turning back to the map. Alastair gave a short, humorless laugh. "The Cotters will not sell. Their family has hated ours for a century over a disputed property line. They would rather burn the mill to the ground than sell it back to a Beaumont." "Everyone has a price, Your Grace," Ilara said coolly, though a knot of annoyance tightened in her stomach. "Another obstacle." "Not them," he said with certainty. He looked at her then, a direct, challenging gaze. He expected her to be stymied. To have hit a wall her money could not break down. Instead of arguing, she changed tactics. "Very well. If we cannot mill our own wool, we will sell it better. The prices at the local market are controlled by a merchant who gives kickbacks to Lord Ashworth. I've seen the records. We are being cheated. My father's ships sail to the continent twice a month from Liverpool. They have cargo space. We will transport our own wool and sell it directly to the Flemish weavers. We will cut out the middlemen entirely. The silence that followed was profound. Henderson was staring at her, his mouth slightly agape, a look of dawning wonder on his face. The idea was so simple, yet so revolutionary. It required a different way of thinking, a merchant's way. Alistair's expression was harder to read. The challenge in his eyes had been replaced by something else. Something she could not quite name. It was not admiration. Not yet. But it was a far cry from the contempt she was used to. It was grudging respect. He had looked at her and seen, for the first time, not the merchant's daughter who had blackmailed him, but a strategist. An equal. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "See to it, Henderson," he said, his voice quiet. Then he turned and walked out of the library, the sound of his riding boots fading down the hall. He had not undermined her. He had not contradicted her. He had, in his own clipped, ducal way, deferred to her judgment in front of his own men. It was a small thing. A tiny crack in the armor of his pride. But to Elara, standing in the dusty, sunlit library, it felt like a tectonic shift. For the first time since she had arrived at Blackwood, she felt a glimmer of something other than defiance. She felt a spark of hope. That evening, as they sat for their silent dinner, the oppressive tension had lessened, replaced by a new, awkward awareness. They were no longer just jailer and prisoner. They were colleagues. Unwilling colleagues, perhaps, but colleagues nonetheless. After the meal, as he was about to retreat to his wing, he paused at the door. "The library fire," he said, without turning to look at her. "You have it burning too hot. It is drying out the bindings on the books." It was a criticism, but it was a practical one. It was advice. "I will instruct the staff to use less wood," she replied, her own voice carefully neutral. He nodded and was gone. Elara remained at the table for a long time, staring at his empty chair. A shared observation about a foolish ancestor. A grudging acknowledgement of her strategy. A piece of practical advice about book preservation. These were the barest scraps of connection, but in the cold, silent expanse of Blackwood Manor, they felt like a feast. The thaw, it seemed, had begun. The first hint of a true alliance came not from a ledger book, but from a confession. Weeks had turned into a month, and a fragile, unspoken truce had settled over the house. Elara's days were a whirlwind of activity. She had hired stonemasons to begin the most urgent roof repairs, brought in agricultural experts to oversee the restoration of the fields, and established a direct line of transport for the estate's wool to the port at Liverpool. The house was slowly coming back to life. The staff, seeing tangible improvements and feeling the weight of coin in their pockets from promptly paid wages, were beginning to thaw. Mrs. Croft had even offered her a cup of tea one afternoon, an act so unexpected it felt like a formal declaration of peace. Alistair remained a distant, watchful presence. He no longer confined himself to the West Wing, but would often appear in the library or the estate office, observing her work in silence. He would ask curt, pointed questions about contracts or crop yields. He was testing her, dissecting her methods. He was also, she realized, learning from her. One night, she was working late in the library, trying to reconcile a particularly baffling discrepancy in the accounts from 5 years prior. The fire had burned low, and a deep, weary ache had settled between her shoulder blades. She heard a noise and looked up to see Alistair standing by the drinks cabinet, pouring 2 glasses of brandy. He brought one over and set it on the desk beside her, the clink of the heavy crystal on the wood startlingly loud in the quiet room. "You will work yourself into an early grave," he said. It was not a complaint, but a statement of fact. "There is a great deal of work to be done," she replied, rubbing her tired eyes. He did not retreat to his usual chair by the fire. Instead, he leaned against the edge of the desk, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. The silence stretched, but it was different now. It was not empty, but full of unspoken thoughts. "It is not just about the money, is it?" he finally said, his voice low. "The debt was a weapon. But I was not the only target." Elara looked up at him, surprised by his astuteness. "No," she admitted. "You were not." He took a slow sip of brandy, his eyes dark and shadowed in the dim light. "Lord Westerfield," he said, naming a powerful, grasping earl who had long been a political rival of the Beaumonts. "He has been trying to absorb my holdings for years." He wants my seat in the Lords, my influence in the North. He backed the banking consortium that held the mortgage. He was waiting for me to default, to be so weakened that he could step in and acquire what was left. At a bargain price, of course. He spoke with a weary bitterness she had never heard from him before. This was not the proud, arrogant Duke. This was a man confessing the immense, crushing weight of his legacy. The mask was slipping. The debts my grandfather incurred, he continued, staring into his glass as if seeing the past there, they were not just foolishness. They were a vulnerability. A breach in the fortress walls. I have spent every day since my father's death trying to patch the walls, knowing that Westerfield was out there, circling, waiting for the final collapse. When you arrived, I thought you were another of his agents. A more creative one, perhaps. The admission stunned her. His initial cruelty, his cold fury, it had not just been about his pride or her social class. It had been born of fear. The fear of a cornered man who mistook a potential rescuer for another predator. I am not his agent, she said softly. I know that now, he said. He finally looked at her, and for the first time, she saw not a duke, but just a man. A tired, burdened man. But you have only plugged the hole in the dam. Westerfield will simply find another way to break it. Here it was. The shared burden. He had laid the true nature of the war at her feet. And in doing so, he was, perhaps without even realizing it, asking for her help. Ilara's mind, trained for strategy, began to work. Her fatigue fell away, replaced by the familiar, exhilarating hum of a problem to be solved. A fortress can be defended from within, she said, her voice gaining strength. But the best defense is a good offense. We cannot just save Blackwood. We have to make it a weapon. She stood up and walked to the estate maps, her mind racing. Westerfield controls the local markets. He squeezes our tenants and undercuts our prices. We are bypassing him with the wool, but that is not enough. We need to break his hold entirely. She pointed to a swath of land on the map. This is the old North Road. It has been impassable for 50 years. But if we were to repair it, it would create a direct trade route to the industrial towns in the west, completely bypassing Westerfield's territory. His market town would become a backwater overnight. Alistair came to stand beside her, his gaze following her finger. Repairing that road would cost a fortune. It would take an army of men. We have an army of men, she countered. Our tenants. They are idle for much of the winter. We will pay them for their labor. It will inject cash into the local economy, cash that will be loyal to us, not to Westerfield. And the cost of the repairs will be an investment. It will pay for itself within 3 years in increased revenues. I have already done the calculations. She turned to him, her eyes bright with the fire of her idea. We will use my father's commerce to wage your political war. We will build a new trade route and make this estate so prosperous, so powerful, that Westerfield will not dare to challenge you. We will not just defend the fortress. We will make it the capital of a new empire. He was staring at her, his expression a complex mixture of awe and disbelief. She was not just a clever accountant. She was a general. She saw the world as a battlefield of logistics and finance, and she knew how to win. The autumn rains came early that year, a relentless, driving downpour that turned the fields to mud and the sky to a permanent shade of bruised gray. The work on the North Road had begun, but the weather stalled it, creating a new, more immediate crisis. The river, swollen and angry, was threatening the old dam that protected the low-lying southern fields, the very fields they had just invested a small fortune in draining and liming. A frantic tenant farmer had ridden to the manor in the dead of night, his face slick with rain and panic. A massive oak tree, loosened by the sodden earth, had fallen and crashed into the dam's primary sluice gate, jamming it shut. The water level was rising fast. If the dam broke, it would wipe out a dozen tenant cottages and ruin the fields for a generation. There was no time to send for help. Alistair, woken by the commotion, was already pulling on boots and a heavy oilskin coat when Ilara met him in the hall. She was dressed just as practically, in a borrowed pair of boys' trousers and a thick woolen cloak, her hair hastily braided. You should stay here, he said, his tone clipped and commanding. It will be dangerous. The money I invested in those fields is at risk, she shot back, her chin set stubbornly. I am coming. He looked at her for a moment, at the determination in her eyes, and seemed to understand that arguing was pointless. He simply nodded and led the way out into the raging storm. The scene at the dam was chaos. Lanterns swung wildly in the wind, casting dancing, demonic shadows. The roar of the river was deafening. A group of about 20 men, tenants and farmhands, were struggling in the churning, waist-deep water, trying to budge the massive oak with ropes and levers, but it was hopelessly wedged. Alistair took command instantly, his voice cutting through the storm's roar. He organized the men, directing their efforts, his aristocratic aloofness stripped away to reveal a core of natural leadership. He was in the water with them, his shoulder to a lever, his face grim with effort. Ilara, seeing the futility of brute force, waded into the shallows to get a better look. The problem wasn't just the weight of the tree, it was the angle. It was wedged against the stone buttress of the dam. They needed to change the direction of the force. She fought her way through the current to Alistair's side. "It's no good," she shouted over the din. "You're pushing against the stone. You need to pull the top of the tree downstream, to pivot it." He looked at her, his eyes streaming with rain, then at the tree, and immediately saw the logic in her words. It was a problem of physics, of leverage. He bellowed new orders, redirecting the men. They looped ropes around the upper branches and, with Alistair and a half-dozen others providing a counterforce on the bank, they began to pull. The work was brutal and exhausting. The water was shockingly cold, stealing the breath and numbing the limbs. Ilara worked alongside the men, hauling on a rope, her small frame straining with the effort. Mud and debris churned around them. At one point, her foot slipped on a slick rock and she went under, the icy water a shocking, violent embrace. A strong hand gripped the back of her cloak and hauled her up, sputtering and gasping. It was Alistair. His face was inches from hers, his expression fierce with concern. "Are you all right?" he yelled. She just nodded, unable to speak, and gripped the rope again. Slowly, agonizingly, the great tree began to pivot. There was a groaning, scraping sound of wood against stone, and then with a great lurch, it broke free. The immense pressure of the water caught it, and the massive trunk was swept away down the roaring river. A ragged cheer went up from the exhausted men. The dam was holding. They trudged back to the manor in the pre-dawn light, a small, weary army caked in mud and soaked to the bone. The storm had passed, leaving a bruised, exhausted silence. In the main hall, Mrs. Croft and the other servants waited with blankets and hot, spiced wine. Ilara was shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. As she reached for a blanket, her numb fingers fumbled. Alistair, standing beside her, took the heavy wool blanket and wrapped it firmly around her shoulders, his hands lingering for a moment longer than necessary. It was a simple, protective gesture, but in the context of their cold, transactional marriage, it was monumental. Later, after a hot bath, they found themselves alone in the library. The fire was roaring, the room a haven of warmth and light. They were both dressed in warm, dry dressing gowns, sipping brandy. They were too tired to speak, but the silence was comfortable, companionable. It was the easy silence of soldiers who had survived a battle together. Ilara noticed a long, angry scratch on his cheek, beaded with a few drops of blood where a branch must have caught him. Without thinking, driven by an impulse she did not understand, she reached out. Her fingers, gentle and hesitant, brushed his cheek as she wiped away the blood with her thumb. He froze at her touch. His skin was cold, but a current of heat seemed to pass between them. He did not pull away. His slate-gray eyes, usually so guarded, were fixed on hers, and in their depths, she saw a raw, unguarded vulnerability. The touch was not romantic. It was functional. An act of simple care. But it was the most intimate they had ever been. He slowly raised his hand and covered hers, his calloused, rough fingers enveloping her own. His thumb stroked the back of her hand, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. The armor was gone. Stripped away by the storm, the mud, and the shared ordeal. In its place was something new. Something fragile, terrifying, and undeniably real. Months passed. The chill of winter gave way to the tentative warmth of a late spring. Blackwood Manor was transformed. The roof no longer leaked, the gardens were being reclaimed from the weeds, and the north road was nearly complete. The estate was not just solvent, it was becoming profitable, a hub of renewed industry and hope. The name Beaumont, once whispered with pity, was now spoken with a new respect. But the true transformation had been within the manor's grey stone walls. The house was no longer divided into east and west wings. Alastair had, without ceremony, moved his things into the rooms adjoining hers. Dinners were no longer silent ordeals but lively discussions of estate business, politics, and sometimes, even books. They were a team, a partnership forged in ledgers and cemented in mud. To re-establish their position and celebrate the manor's revival, they decided to host a grand ball. It was a strategic move, a declaration to the county and to their rivals that the House of Beaumont was back. Invitations were sent, caterers hired, and the grand ballroom, which had stood silent and shrouded for a decade, was aired out and polished to a gleam. Ilara stood before the mirror in her dressing room, feeling a familiar knot of anxiety. It was a different kind of anxiety from the one she'd felt at the Duke of Rutland's ball. This was not the fear of an outsider, but the pressure of a commander before a decisive battle. She was no longer Ilara Vance, the merchant's daughter. She was the Duchess of Beaumont, and tonight, she was on display. Her gown was magnificent, a deep sapphire silk that shimmered like a starlit sky. Around her neck was a heavy diamond necklace, a Beaumont heirloom that Alastair had insisted she wear. It felt cold against her skin, a beautiful, heavy weight. A symbol of her new station. Alastair entered the room, already dressed in severe black evening wear that now seemed to accentuate his power rather than his austerity. He stopped, his eyes taking her in. "You look," he started, then paused, as if searching for a word that was adequate. "Formidable," he finally said, a rare, small smile touching his lips. "It is armor," she replied, touching the cold diamonds at her throat. "Then we go into battle together," he said, offering her his arm. His touch was warm and steady. The ballroom was a blaze of light and sound. The county had turned out in force, their curiosity piqued by the rumors of Blackwood's miraculous recovery. The air was thick with whispers, the rustle of silk, and the scent of expensive perfume. Ilara could feel the eyes on them as they made their grand entrance, 100 pairs of eyes dissecting her, judging her. But with Alastair's hand firmly on her arm, she felt not fear, but a sense of rightness. This was her place. She had not been given it, she had built it. They moved through the crowd, a united front. Alastair was a gracious host, his natural authority now tempered with a warmth she had never seen in him before. Ilara, for her part, discussed crop rotation with a local squire and trade routes with a shipping merchant with equal, confident ease. They were a formidable pair, his lineage and her brilliance, a potent combination. But not everyone was pleased by their success. Ilara had excused herself to get a glass of lemonade when she was cornered near an alcove by a small group of women. At their center was Lady Beatrice, a cousin of Alastair's known for her sharp tongue and vapid beauty. She had always viewed Ilara with unconcealed disdain. "My dear Duchess," Beatrice began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "one must congratulate you. You have done wonders with the old house. It is amazing what a bit of trade money can accomplish." The other women tittered. It was a carefully aimed barb, designed to remind everyone of Ilara's origins. "Indeed," Ilara replied, her voice calm. "It is amazing what a bit of hard work can accomplish. You should try it sometime, Beatrice." Beatrice's smile tightened. Before she could retort, a new voice joined the fray. It was Lord Finchley, a sycophantic landowner and a known crony of their rival, Lord Westerfield. "Come now, Your Grace," Finchley said with a greasy smile, "no need for false modesty. Everyone knows the Duke was on his last legs. You simply made the highest bid. A brilliant bit of shopkeeping, buying yourself a title. One must admire the enterprise." The insult was blatant, public. He had called her a prostitute in all but name. The surrounding conversation died down as people turned to watch. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the public challenge to the upstart Duchess. Ilara felt a familiar coldness settle in her stomach. She opened her mouth to deliver a retort, a cutting, precise remark that would put Finchley in his place. But she never got the chance. "Finchley." The voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it cut through the room like a shard of ice. Alastair had appeared at her side, seemingly from nowhere. He had placed a hand on the small of her back, a small, possessive, supportive gesture. His face was a mask of lethal calm, but his eyes were blazing with a cold fury that made his earlier anger at her seem like a passing irritation. "Your Grace," Finchley stammered, his bravado evaporating under that glacial stare. "I believe you have mistaken my wife for a mirror," Alastair said, his voice dangerously soft. "As you are the only one here who has made a habit of selling yourself to the highest bidder. Is Lord Westerfield's patronage truly worth the price of your dignity?" A collective gasp went through the onlookers. It was a devastatingly direct hit. Finchley paled. I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," Alastair continued, his voice never rising but gaining a new, hard edge. "But let us speak of what my wife has bought. She did not buy a title. She earned one. With an intellect that you could not begin to comprehend. With a strength of character that you have never possessed. She did not simply buy this house," he gestured around the glittering ballroom. "She saved it. She saved my family's legacy from the incompetence of my ancestors and the greed of men like your master. I am not the prize she won, Finchley. I am the man fortunate enough to have been saved by her." He paused, letting his words sink in. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. "This woman," he said, his voice ringing with a fierce, unwavering pride as he looked down at Alara, "is the Duchess of Beaumont by right of merit, a concept I am sure is foreign to you. She is the heart of this house and the keeper of its future. And you will address her with the respect she is owed." Then he turned his chilling gaze back to Finchley. "As for your own finances, I happen to be reviewing some old contracts for the Northwoods timber rights. It is amazing what a careful eye can find. For instance, evidence of embezzlement, of kickbacks funneled into a secret account. An account in your name. I believe the authorities, and Lord Westerfield, will be very interested to see it." Finchley looked as if he had been physically struck. His face was ashen, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. He was ruined. Utterly and completely ruined, in the middle of a ballroom, in front of the entire county. Lady Beatrice and her friends melted back into the crowd, their faces pale with shock. They had come to see a humiliation and had instead witnessed an execution. Alastair did not spare the ruined man another glance. He turned to the stunned crowd, his expression stern. "The music has stopped," he announced. "Please continue." As if a spell had been broken, the orchestra hesitantly began to play again. Whispers erupted, but they were no longer whispers of gossip. They were whispers of awe. The Duke and Duchess of Beaumont were not just restored. They were a power. A unified, unassailable force. Alastair looked down at Alara, the fury in his eyes replaced by a deep, tender concern. "Are you all right?" She could only nod, her throat tight with an emotion she could not name. It was triumph. It was gratitude. It was love. He had not just defended her honor. He had declared her his equal, his partner, his savior, in front of the entire world. He had given her the one thing her money could never buy, his genuine, public, and profound respect. He squeezed her hand. "Let us go," he murmured, for her ears only. "I believe this battle is won." They left the ballroom together, leaving behind the wreckage of their enemies and the birth of their legend. The journey from the glittering ballroom to their private wing was made in a profound silence. It was not the hostile silence of their early days, nor the awkward silence of their truce. It was the heavy, humming silence that follows a great battle, thick with exhaustion and unspoken emotion. The distant sound of the orchestra was a faint echo from another world. This world, here in the quiet, shadowed corridor, belonged only to them. He led her into her sitting room, the one that adjoined his own. A single lamp burned, casting a soft, intimate glow. The air was warm from the embers of a dying fire. He closed the door behind them, the soft thud shutting out the rest of the world. Ilara felt emotionally and physically drained, as if she had been the one to fight the duel. The sapphire silk of her gown felt impossibly heavy, the diamonds of the Beaumont necklace a cold, tight collar around her throat. She raised her hands to unclasp it, but her fingers were trembling, clumsy. "Here," Alastair said, his voice a low murmur. He stepped behind her. She stood perfectly still, watching his reflection in the tall, dark mirror. His face was serious, his eyes focused on his task. His fingers, calloused from his work on the estate but surprisingly gentle, brushed against the nape of her neck as he worked the intricate clasp. The touch was electric, a jolt of warmth against her cool skin. With a soft click, the necklace came free. He did not hand it to her. Instead, he carefully placed the heavy cascade of diamonds on the mantelpiece, setting it aside as if it were a piece of armor that was no longer needed. The symbolic act was not lost on her. He was removing the public symbol of her station, leaving only the woman beneath. He did not step away. He remained behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. In the mirror, their eyes met. The granite mask of the Duke was gone completely. In its place was the face of Alistair, a man stripped bare of his pride and his prejudice, his expression full of a raw, vulnerable emotion that made her heart ache. "When I first saw you," he began, his voice rough, "at Rutland's ball, I was a desperate man. I was drowning, and I was too proud to admit it. I looked at you, and I did not see a woman. I saw a symbol of everything I thought I was losing to. The modern world. Commerce. Money without heritage. My cruelty to you," he paused, and she could see him swallow. It was the lashing out of a cornered, terrified animal. It was born of my fear and my ignorance. And it was unforgivable. "Alistair," she started, turning to face him, but he gently held her in place, forcing them both to keep looking at their reflections. "No, let me finish," he insisted. "I need to say this. When you came here, to this house, with your contract and your terms, I hated you. I have never hated anyone so much in my life. Because you held up a mirror, and you showed me what I had become, a failure, propped up by nothing but a name. I watched you. I watched you work, watched you pore over my family's mistakes, watched you breathe life back into this place with nothing but your brilliance and your will. My hatred turned to respect. My respect turned to admiration. And my admiration, Ilara." He finally fell silent. His hands tightened on her shoulders. She turned then, breaking the spell of the mirror. She stood before him, so close she could feel the heat from his body, and looked up into his face. "And your admiration," she prompted softly. "My admiration," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "has become love. A love so profound it frightens me. I do not just respect you, Ilara. I love you. I love your mind, I love your strength, I love the way you look when you are dissecting a ledger as if it were a love poem. I love you." The confession hung in the air, simple, absolute, and utterly devastating. Tears pricked at Ilara's eyes, the emotion she had held in check for so long finally overwhelming her. "I came here for revenge," she confessed, her own voice thick with unshed tears. "I came here because you hurt me, and I wanted to hurt you back. I wanted to own your house, to control your life, to show you that the merchant's daughter could bring a duke to his knees. It was a plan born of anger and pride." "And now?" he asked, his thumbs gently stroking her shoulders. "And now," she said, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, "I find that I am the one on my knees. I did not want to feel anything for you. I built a fortress around my heart. But you, with your surprising kindness, your hidden vulnerabilities, your fierce loyalty, you laid siege to it. You did not break down the walls. You simply waited for me to open the gate. I love you, Alistair." A look of immense relief washed over his face, as if he had been holding his breath for an eternity. He slowly lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers. "Ilara," he breathed her name like a prayer. He framed her face with his hands, his gaze searching hers, asking a silent question. She gave him a small, trembling nod. He kissed her. It was nothing like the cold, sterile peck at their wedding. This was not a kiss of contract or convenience. This was a kiss of confession, of surrender, of homecoming. It was not gentle or hesitant. It was deep and sure, heavy with all the unspoken words, the shared struggles, the hard-won respect that had grown between them. It was a kiss that sealed not a bargain, but a partnership. It tasted of brandy, and triumph, and the promise of a future. It was grounded. It was real. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, holding her close. The battle was won. The war was over. And in the quiet heart of Blackwood Manor, two enemies had finally, irrevocably, surrendered to each other. 1 year later, the spring sunlight streamed through the tall library windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. But there was no film of grime on the sills, no scent of damp or decay. The room was warm, alive, filled with the scent of polished wood, blooming flowers from the gardens, and fresh ink. Ilara stood by the window, looking out over a landscape transformed. The formal gardens were a riot of color, meticulously tended. In the distance, she could see a wagon laden with goods trundling along the newly completed North Road, a testament to their victory. Blackwood was not just surviving, it was thriving, the vibrant heart of a prosperous and revitalized domain. She was not looking at a ledger. The estate's books were balanced, the accounts healthy. Instead, she was reviewing a proposal, a map of shipping routes spreading across a chart of the Atlantic. The door opened and closed softly. She didn't need to turn. She knew the sound of his footsteps, the weight of his presence in the room. Alistair came to stand behind her, his arms circling her waist as he rested his chin on her shoulder. He looked over her shoulder at the chart. "Your father's new venture?" he asked, his voice a low, comfortable rumble against her ear. "He wants to expand the trade routes to the Americas," she said. "He is offering us a partnership. A significant share, in exchange for an investment to build 2 new ships." A year ago, the idea of investing in anything other than a new roof would have been a fantasy, he murmured, his lips brushing her temple. "What does our financial counsel think?" Ilara smiled, leaning back against him. "Our financial counsel," she said, tapping her own temple, "thinks it is a sound investment with a projected return of 20% within 5 years. She thinks the risk is manageable, and the potential for long-term growth is substantial." He chuckled, a warm, easy sound that she had come to cherish. "And what does the Duke think?" "The Duke," she said, turning in his arms to face him, "should trust his Duchess implicitly in all matters of finance." "He does," Alistair said, his expression soft and full of a love that still, after a year, had the power to take her breath away. "He just likes to hear her say it." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of shared mornings and quiet evenings, of partnership and deep, abiding affection. The ghosts of debt and ruin were long gone, banished by their joint efforts. The cold, decaying manor had become a warm, vibrant home. The contract they had signed in a dusty office had been rewritten, day by day, into a love story. He held her close, his hand resting on the small swell of her stomach, a new secret, a new future they were just beginning to share. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the world was waking up to spring. But here, in the heart of Blackwood, in the quiet circle of his arms, Ilara knew she had found her place long ago. It wasn't a station to be bought or a title to be won. It was a home, built on a foundation of mutual respect, and cemented with a love as strong and enduring as the ancient oaks that gave the manor its name.